From the moment Michael Joseph Jackson opened his mouth to sing, the world knew there was something extraordinary about him. Born on August 29, 1958, in Gary, Indiana, the eighth of 10 children in a working-class African-American family, Michael's childhood was not filled with the freedom or laughter one might imagine for a boy with such an angelic voice. His father, Joseph Jackson, was a strict, almost militant man who worked in a steel mill by day and drilled his sons into musical perfection by night. Their small house on Jackson Street became an echo chamber of rehearsals, scoldings, and relentless pursuit of precision. While other children played outside, Michael and his brothers, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, and Marlon, were mastering harmonies, steps, and stage presence that would soon captivate the nation. Michael was barely 5 when he was pulled into the family band, the Jackson Brothers, later renamed the Jackson 5. What began as local talent shows soon turned into a nationwide phenomenon. With his unmatched energy, charisma, and pure voice, Michael quickly became the centerpiece. Audiences were mesmerized. Here was a tiny boy with the soul of a man, commanding the stage like he'd been born on it. When Motown discovered them in 1968, Berry Gordy immediately recognized the lightning in this small, brown-skinned child's voice. The Jackson 5's first single, I Want You Back, shot to number 1. Then came ABC, The Love You Save, I'll Be There, 4 consecutive chart-topping hits. Michael was barely 12. Behind the fame, however, childhood slipped away. While millions of kids were idolizing him, Michael himself was longing for a normal life, one where he could play outside, go to school dances, or just have friends who didn't see him as Michael Jackson, the star. In interviews years later, he would often reflect on that loss, speaking softly about how lonely it was to live inside fame so young. His father's punishments, both physical and emotional, left scars that would haunt him well into adulthood. He once recalled Joseph standing nearby during rehearsals, holding a belt, waiting for any mistake. That tension, that fear, became the foundation of his perfectionism. Every note, every move had to be flawless, because in Michael's mind, love and approval were things earned through excellence. As the 1970s unfolded, the little boy from Gary began to grow up, and so did his ambitions. The Jackson 5 were no longer just America's darlings, they were global icons. Yet within Michael, there was an artist desperate to evolve beyond the bubblegum pop image. His creative hunger pushed him toward independence. When Motown refused to let him write his own songs, he began seeking more control. By the mid-1970s, he and his brothers left Motown for Epic Records, rebranding themselves as the Jacksons. The music matured, and so did Michael's voice, smoother, richer, filled with both pain and possibility. Songs like Shake Your Body, Down to the Ground, and Can You Feel It hinted at what was to come, a solo star waiting to be unleashed. That breakthrough arrived in 1979 with Off the Wall. Teaming up with producer Quincy Jones, whom he met while filming The Wiz, Michael created something revolutionary, a blend of pop, funk, and soul that sounded unlike anything before it. Don't Stop Till You Get Enough and Rock With You became instant classics. The album sold over 20 million copies worldwide, earning him his first Grammy. But what truly set Off the Wall apart wasn't just its success, it was its statement. It announced Michael not as a child star, not as the frontman of a family band, but as a visionary. Still, for Michael, success was never enough. Deep inside, there was always the voice of his father, the pressure of the public, and the need to be not just good, but untouchable. When Off the Wall won only 1 Grammy despite its critical acclaim, Michael took it personally. I was hurt, he later said. I was happy for the one I got, but I wanted them all. That quiet fire became his driving force. He vowed his next project would be the greatest album ever made. In 1982, that vow became Thriller. Once again alongside Quincy Jones, Michael poured his entire being into the music, experimenting with sound, rhythm, and even horror elements that no one had dared to fuse into pop before. The result was nothing short of history. Billie Jean, Beat It, Human Nature, Thriller, each track became a cultural event. And when the Thriller music video premiered, it didn't just break records, it broke boundaries. Michael turned the music video into an art form, a cinematic experience that would define MTV's golden era. The red jacket, the zombie dance, the moonwalk, these became symbols of a new kind of stardom. By 1984, Thriller had sold more than any album before it, transforming Michael Jackson into the undisputed king of pop. But with that crown came a heavy burden. Michael had conquered the world, yet he still chased an invisible ideal. He wanted to be perfect, untouchable, universal. His artistry became not just expression but obsession. In the mid-1980s, he released Bad, another masterpiece, another reinvention. He pushed his image further, his music sharper, his videos grander. Every release became a statement, I am still the best. But something else was happening, something more subtle, more haunting. The man behind the music was disappearing beneath the myth. The media began to fixate on his changing appearance. His skin lightened, his nose thinned, his face seemed to morph with every passing year. Rumors swirled, bleaching, surgery, vanity, but the truth was far more complex. Michael was battling vitiligo, a skin condition that destroys pigmentation, and lupus, an autoimmune disease. He used makeup to even his tone, but the press twisted it into a grotesque narrative of self-hatred. Tabloids branded him Wacko Jacko, a name he despised. They mocked his eccentricities, his pet chimp, his reclusive lifestyle, his Neverland dreams, never realizing that many of these were his attempts to reclaim the childhood he never had. Still, Michael kept creating. He danced as if gravity was optional, sang as if his voice could heal the world, and performed as if the stage were his only safe place. Dangerous in 1991 showcased his maturity, socially conscious, musically daring, and emotionally raw. Songs like Black or White and Heal the World carried messages far beyond entertainment. He had become not just an artist, but a symbol of unity, of hope, of imagination unbound. And yet, the higher he climbed, the lonelier the summit became. Fame had isolated him. Every movement, every word, every friendship was dissected. He no longer walked among people, he floated above them, trapped in a bubble of adoration and suspicion. His relationships grew strained, his trust diminished. The very spotlight that had made him a god now blinded him to the simple joys of life. Behind the mask of sequins and smiles, there was a man yearning for peace, for authenticity, for escape. Throughout the late 80s and early 90s, Michael reinvented himself again and again, visually, musically, emotionally. He became a master of transformation, shifting from the electrifying showman in Smooth Criminal to the poetic dreamer of Earth Song. Every era of his career was like a chapter in an evolving myth, the child prodigy, the innovator, the recluse, the humanitarian. He refused to be confined by genre or identity. I don't want to just be a star, he once said. I want to be timeless. That desire drove everything he did, but it also fed the paradox of his life. For every groundbreaking performance, there was an equally relentless scrutiny. For every reinvention, another piece of his true self faded behind the legend. The boy who once sang of ABCs and puppy love had grown into a man who could move the world with a whisper, yet could not find solace in his own reflection. By the mid-1990s, the king of pop was both omnipresent and unreachable, adored by millions, understood by few. His home, Neverland Ranch, stood as both a sanctuary and a symbol of his inner world, a place frozen in innocence, untouched by the cynicism of adulthood. There were carousels, elephants, and movie theaters, but behind the gates, there was also silence. In the stillness of night, when the crowds were gone and the lights dimmed, Michael was left alone with the echoes of applause and the ghosts of his past. His journey from Gary, Indiana, to global superstardom was not merely the story of a career, it was the story of a soul divided. He had become what he'd always dreamed of being, the greatest performer alive. But the cost of that dream was innocence, privacy, and peace. Every dance step was polished, every lyric deliberate, every note perfect, but perfection came at the price of personhood. The applause never really stopped for Michael Jackson. It only changed tone. One moment, it was thunderous, millions cheering the king of pop, their voices rising like a tidal wave of love. The next, it was quieter, sharper, distorted through the whisper of tabloids and gossip shows that fed on every flicker of his life. In the glow of success, Michael stood at the pinnacle of everything he had dreamed of. But beneath that glittering surface, cracks had already begun to form, fractures that fame, no matter how dazzling, could not conceal. In the early 1990s, Michael's fame was something the world had never seen before. He was not just a celebrity, he was a phenomenon, a face recognized on every continent, a voice that echoed across generations. He had spent decades perfecting his craft, reinventing himself again and again, becoming more than a man, a myth. But myths come at a cost. And for Michael, that cost was his humanity. The more untouchable he became, the more the world seemed eager to touch, to pry, to uncover what lay beneath the perfection. When he released Dangerous in 1991, it was a creative triumph, a fusion of innovation, rebellion, and soul. Songs like Black or White, Remember the Time, and Heal the World reflected a new maturity, a man seeking meaning beyond the music. The album shattered records and expectations, yet the success only magnified the scrutiny. Every move he made became a headline, every friendship dissected, every appearance analyzed under the microscope of fame. People didn't just want to hear Michael Jackson sing, they wanted to know who he was, how he lived, what he hid. And so the media began to build a second Michael, not the artist, but the spectacle. The reclusive genius. The man-child who lived in a fantasy world. The enigma who refused to grow old. Wacko Jacko, they called him, a name Michael despised, one that mocked the very essence of who he was. They wrote stories of oxygen chambers, chimpanzees, and porcelain dolls, painting him as something alien, almost inhuman. What they never understood was that Neverland, his sanctuary of carousels and laughter, was not a symbol of madness, it was his rebellion against the pain of his own childhood. He wasn't trying to escape reality. He was trying to rebuild it into something beautiful. But beauty attracts darkness. In 1993, the first storm struck. A 13-year-old boy accused Michael of something unspeakable, child molestation. The news exploded like a bomb across the globe. For a man who had built his identity on innocence, love, and compassion, it was a blow that cut deeper than any wound fame had ever given him. The media went into a frenzy. Cameras camped outside his gates. Talk shows speculated endlessly. The same networks that once crowned him the king of pop now called him a monster. The boy who had once sung "I'll Be There" to millions now found no one standing by him. Michael denied the allegations, maintaining his innocence with quiet desperation. His friends and family rallied, but the damage had already been done. He was forced into depositions, interrogations, and the brutal machinery of public judgment. The stress broke him. He turned to painkillers to endure, his voice trembling as he appeared on television to tell the world he was innocent. "I would never harm a child," he said, his eyes glistening with disbelief at how far the world had fallen from trust. The case was eventually settled out of court, not as an admission of guilt, but as a way to end the nightmare. Yet the stain never left. To many, the question remained unanswered, and in the court of public opinion, doubt was more powerful than truth. The aftermath left Michael a shell of himself. He withdrew further into isolation, retreating behind the gates of Neverland, where fantasy could still feel safe. But even there, the silence was no refuge. The whispers followed him, echoing through tabloids, late-night jokes, and cruel speculation. For years, he tried to drown them out with music. In 1995, he released History, Past, Present and Future, a double album that was both retrospective and defiant. Songs like "They Don't Care About Us" and "Scream" weren't just tracks, they were cries of pain, rage, and resilience. "I'm tired of injustice," he sang, "I'm tired of the schemes." It was his most personal work yet, an artist fighting for his identity in a world that wanted to destroy it. The 1990s became a decade of contradiction for Michael. He remained one of the most famous people alive, yet one of the most isolated. His marriages, first to Lisa Marie Presley, then to Debbie Rowe, were dissected as media performances, though those close to him insisted he was searching for something real, something pure. Fatherhood brought him moments of genuine peace. When his children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, were born, Michael seemed to find a new kind of love, one untainted by fame. He was often seen with them hidden beneath veils, not to shield them from himself, but from the world that had already devoured his childhood. "I don't want them to go through what I went through," he once said softly. "I want them to have their own lives." Yet the world refused to let him rest. The early 2000s brought another wave of allegations. Another boy. Another trial. Another spectacle. In 2003, British journalist Martin Bashir's documentary Living with Michael Jackson aired, showing Michael in his most vulnerable and misunderstood form. The interview was meant to be a portrait of his life, but instead, it became an ambush. Bashir's narration painted him as delusional, even dangerous. When Michael spoke about sharing his bed with children, words meant innocently, in his view, they were twisted into scandalous headlines. The world's compassion turned once again into cruelty. In 2005, Michael was charged with child molestation once more. The trial was brutal, televised, humiliating. He was forced to relive every nightmare from the past, every lie, every insinuation. But this time, he fought, and won. The jury acquitted him of all charges. Yet victory did not bring peace. The damage was irreversible. By then, Michael was fragile, physically, emotionally, spiritually. His reputation had been shredded, his finances strained, his health deteriorating. The world that once worshipped him had turned into a mirror of judgment. He had spent his life giving everything, his art, his heart, his innocence, and in return, he had become both adored and despised. Fame had given him immortality, but it had stolen his humanity. He no longer trusted anyone. He spoke less, smiled rarely, and surrounded himself with only a handful of loyal souls. Neverland was sold. The laughter was gone. The boy who once built a dreamland to escape pain now lived like a ghost wandering through its ruins. Still, beneath the exhaustion, a spark remained. Music was his oxygen, and no matter how battered his spirit became, he still believed in the magic of the stage. By 2007, rumors began to spread that Michael was planning something new, a comeback. It seemed impossible. He hadn't toured in over a decade. His health was frail, his confidence shattered. But for Michael, performing was not just a career, it was survival. It was the only time he felt whole, alive, and understood. The whispers of a return grew louder, until in March 2009, the impossible became real. Michael appeared before a roaring London crowd to announce his new tour, This Is It. The press conference at the O2 Arena was brief, but electric. Dressed in a black military-style jacket and sunglasses, Michael stood beneath flashing lights, smiling faintly as the fans screamed his name. "This is it," he said. "These will be my final curtain calls." His voice trembled slightly, a mix of nerves and resolve. For the first time in years, there was hope in his eyes. Hope that he could rewrite the ending of his story, prove to the world, and to himself, that he was still the greatest performer alive. Behind the scenes, the preparation began immediately. The shows were scheduled to start in July, with 10 initial dates. But demand was overwhelming. In just hours, over 1 million tickets sold out, forcing promoters to add 40 more performances. 50 shows. 50 chances for redemption. For Michael, it was both exhilarating and terrifying. He wanted perfection, every step, every note, every illusion had to be flawless. The world would be watching, and he could not afford to falter. He threw himself into rehearsals with the same intensity that had defined him since childhood. Dancers, producers, choreographers, all spoke of his energy, his precision, his drive. It was as if he had found a new heartbeat. Yet behind that revival, his body was failing. The years of stress, insomnia, and pain had left him dependent on medication just to sleep. Dr. Conrad Murray, a physician hired to oversee his health during the comeback, became a constant presence. As the pressure mounted, so did Michael's exhaustion. The rehearsals went late into the night. His perfectionism turned to obsession, his sleeplessness to torment. Those around him noticed the signs, the trembling hands, the fatigue, the whispers of medication. But no one dared to stop him. How could they? He was Michael Jackson, the man who turned pain into art, who had been breaking the laws of possibility his entire life. The final days of rehearsal were bittersweet. On June 23, he performed Earth Song at the Staples Center with breathtaking power, his voice raw but passionate. The crew applauded. Some said he looked happier than he had in years, others sensed something haunting, as if he knew he was giving his last performance. 2 nights later, the world would find out just how fragile that balance between brilliance and exhaustion had become. As the lights dimmed in the rehearsal hall that night, Michael lingered for a moment longer, staring out at the empty seats. He smiled faintly, whispered something to himself, maybe a prayer, maybe a promise, and walked off stage. The sound of his footsteps faded into silence. It was the calm before the storm, the breath before the final curtain. And when the world woke up on June 25, 2009, the king of pop would no longer be alive. The night before it all ended, Michael Jackson stood beneath the bright rehearsal lights of the Staples Center in Los Angeles, his body moving with a fluid grace that defied his frailty. The stage was his sanctuary, and for those final hours, he seemed reborn. Clad in his iconic black jacket and fedora, he glided across the floor with the same hypnotic rhythm that had once made the world stop and watch. The dancers followed every move, the musicians kept their eyes fixed on him, and the air pulsed with a quiet reverence. This wasn't just another rehearsal, it felt like a resurrection. The comeback he had promised the world, "This is it," was only weeks away. The king of pop was finally returning to reclaim his throne. But what the audience could not see was the pain behind the perfection. Every movement, every note, was an act of endurance. Michael's body was exhausted, his nerves frayed, his heart heavy with the weight of expectation. The This Is It tour wasn't just a performance, it was redemption. It was his chance to silence the tabloids, to remind the world who he truly was. For years, he had been reduced to caricature and scandal. Now, he wanted the music to speak again. He wanted to feel the roar of a crowd not out of curiosity or pity, but out of awe. Inside the dim corners of his dressing room, however, the atmosphere was far less electric. Michael was anxious, sometimes trembling. His insomnia had worsened to the point of torment. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, and the constant rehearsals left him drained. Those closest to him described a man torn between euphoria and collapse, ecstatic on stage, but fragile off it. To ease his suffering, he relied on medications, painkillers, sedatives, sleep aids, prescribed and managed by his personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray. Michael called him "my friend." In truth, Murray had become something more complicated, a gatekeeper to the only thing Michael craved, rest. Rehearsals for This Is It were a spectacle of precision. The setlist was a journey through his greatest hits: Billie Jean, Thriller, Beat It, Black or White, Smooth Criminal. Each performance was to be a story, a reflection of every era of his career. He was deeply involved in every detail: the lighting, the choreography, the video sequences, even the pyrotechnics. "We're creating history," he told his team. "I want this to be the greatest show on earth." And in those moments of creative command, the old Michael, the visionary, the perfectionist, reappeared. He was demanding, yes, but not cruel. He pushed everyone to their limits because he pushed himself beyond his own. His musical director, Michael Bearden, recalled that Michael could hear every instrument, every offbeat sound, even in a room full of noise. "He was like a human metronome," Bearden said. He could tell if one note was off by a fraction. But as rehearsals intensified, so did the shadows beneath his eyes. His frame had grown thinner, his cheekbones sharp. Those who worked closest to him began to whisper about his health. Sometimes he appeared euphoric, dancing with childlike joy, other times, detached and distant, lost in a fog of exhaustion. Kenny Ortega, the tour's director, noticed the changes and grew increasingly concerned. He approached Murray several times about Michael's condition, warning that the singer seemed too weak to continue. But Murray reassured everyone that he was fine, that he was monitoring him carefully, that the king of pop was just under stress. What no one realized was that behind closed doors, Michael's struggle with sleep had turned into a desperate dependency. Night after night, he begged for a solution. Traditional sedatives no longer worked. The only thing that could bring him the sleep he needed, he said, was propofol, a powerful anesthetic used in hospitals to induce unconsciousness. It was never meant to be used at home, never meant for insomnia. But Michael was insistent. He called it his milk. And under pressure to keep his patient content, Dr. Murray agreed to administer it. What began as a temporary measure became a nightly ritual, one that would soon spiral out of control. As June 2009 unfolded, time was running out. The This Is It shows were just weeks away, and tickets had sold out in record time. The world was watching. For Michael, the tour wasn't merely a concert, it was his chance to rewrite history, to prove he was still invincible. But beneath the grandeur, there was fear. He worried about his voice, about his body, about living up to his own legend. He would stand in front of mirrors, studying his reflection as if searching for the man he once was. "I have to be perfect," he whispered to his crew one evening. "I have to give them the best show they've ever seen." On June 23rd and 24th, the final rehearsals took place at the Staples Center. Those in attendance would later recall how extraordinary Michael seemed. His performance of Earth Song that night was hauntingly powerful, filled with emotion that transcended exhaustion. "This is what I was born to do," he told his dancers, smiling softly after the music faded. The crew applauded, unaware that these words would be among his last. That night, he walked off stage radiant but trembling, as though his body could no longer contain the energy that his spirit demanded. When he returned home to his rented mansion on North Carrollwood Drive, the tension between his ambition and his frailty reached its breaking point. The house, a sprawling estate in Holmby Hills, had become a kind of gilded prison. The staff tiptoed around him. The children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, stayed nearby, often watching movies with their father, unaware of the turmoil that surrounded him. Dr. Murray occupied one of the guest rooms, tending to Michael's needs. Every night followed the same routine: vitamins, relaxation music, medication, and eventually, the administration of propofol through an 4-drip. Michael would close his eyes and drift away, while Murray monitored him, sometimes by his side, sometimes distracted. But the nights grew longer, and the exhaustion deeper. On the evening of June 24th, after the final rehearsal, Michael returned home past midnight. He was elated but restless. He couldn't sleep. He needed to rest, there was still so much to perfect before London. Murray began the usual sequence of medications: Valium, Ativan, lorazepam, all failed. Hours passed. Michael begged for his milk. Murray hesitated, but eventually relented. Around 1:30 a.m., he administered a small dose of propofol. Then another. Then another. Michael finally drifted into what looked like sleep. The doctor monitored his pulse, his breathing. But somewhere around 2 a.m., something changed. His breathing slowed. His pulse weakened. The silence deepened into something unthinkable. What happened in those next few hours would become the subject of endless debate, lawsuits, and heartbreak. Murray later claimed he left the room briefly to make phone calls. When he returned, Michael was unresponsive. His eyes were open but still. Panic set in. He began CPR, called for help, shouted for security to summon an ambulance. Paramedics arrived, finding Michael lifeless on the bed, his skin cold, his pupils dilated. For over an hour, they tried to revive him: chest compressions, adrenaline, everything. But it was too late. At 2:26 p.m. on June 25, 2009, Michael Joseph Jackson was pronounced dead at UCLA Medical Center. He was 50 years old. News of his death spread faster than anyone could comprehend. Within minutes, social media froze. Television stations cut into regular programming. Fans across the world wept openly in the streets. The king of pop, the man who defined an era, who had reinvented music and dance, who had given his life to performance, was gone. Los Angeles descended into chaos. Outside the hospital, hundreds gathered in disbelief. Some screamed. Some prayed. Some refused to believe it at all. Inside the hospital, his family arrived one by one, stunned and shattered. His mother, Catherine, wept quietly. His sister Janet broke down. The brothers stood in silence, unable to process what they were seeing. The boy from Gary, Indiana, who had once dreamt of sharing his music with the world, had finally fallen silent. The same world that had once adored him, crucified him, and then begged for his return, now stood in mourning. The official cause of death would soon be declared: acute propofol intoxication, administered in a non-hospital setting. The coroner ruled it a homicide. Dr. Conrad Murray was arrested, charged with involuntary manslaughter. But no verdict could truly explain the deeper tragedy, that Michael's death was not just a medical accident, but the culmination of a lifetime spent chasing perfection under unbearable pressure. His body had finally surrendered to what his spirit could no longer carry. In the days that followed, Los Angeles became a shrine. Fans flooded the streets, singing his songs, lighting candles, holding photos. His music filled every radio station, his videos looped endlessly across screens. For a brief, haunting moment, the world united in grief, the same way it had once united in awe. This as it became both a farewell and a prophecy. He had named his comeback tour after the truth he couldn't speak aloud, that this was the end. Yet even in death, Michael Jackson remained larger than life. His rehearsal footage was later compiled into the posthumous documentary This Is It, offering the world a glimpse of his final days, the artist in motion, still chasing greatness despite the shadows closing in. Watching it, fans saw not just a fallen icon, but a man still yearning to give joy. His smile in those scenes was fragile, his voice tender, his eyes bright with a kind of weary hope. It was as though, on some level, he knew his story was reaching its final note, and he wanted to make sure it was beautiful. The tragedy of Michael Jackson's death wasn't only in the loss of a man, but in the revelation of how much he had suffered to remain the myth. Fame had turned his humanity into currency, and his vulnerabilities into headlines. He lived under a microscope so long that even his pain became public property. The boy who once dreamed of being loved by everyone had become the man who could trust no one. And in that irony lies the cruelest truth, that the world's adoration can be as destructive as its hate. In the quiet aftermath, as the candles burned and the tributes poured in, a question lingered in the air: was this truly an accident, or the inevitable consequence of a lifetime of pressure, exploitation, and exhaustion? Was Michael Jackson's death a moment of medical negligence, or the slow, inevitable collapse of a soul that had been stretched too thin by the impossible demands of fame? That question would ignite investigations, trials, and conspiracy theories for years to come. His fans called it murder. Others called it tragedy. But everyone agreed on one thing: the world would never see another like him. The king of pop was gone, but his myth had only just begun. And as the curtain fell on June 25, 2009, the stage that had once been his kingdom stood empty. The lights dimmed, the echoes faded, and in that silence, a new story began, one not about music, but about truth, justice, and the haunting question of what really happened on that final night. The sun rose over Los Angeles on June 25, 2009, like any other morning, but inside the mansion at 100 North Carrollwood Drive, something was deeply wrong. The estate stood grand and quiet, wrapped in sunlight that cut through the tall windows, but within its walls, chaos was brewing, chaos that would soon send shockwaves around the world. Michael Jackson, the most famous man alive, was lying in his bedroom, pale, weak, and fragile. His comeback shows for This Is It were only weeks away. His body was worn down, his nerves frayed, and his dependence on sleep medication had grown dangerous. And on this morning, the man who had once defied gravity on stage was slipping into a silent, irreversible darkness. For months leading up to that morning, Michael's world had been consumed by rehearsals. This Is It was more than just a concert series, it was his redemption, his chance to reclaim the throne. Night after night, at the Staples Center in Los Angeles, he practiced tirelessly, driven by the same perfectionism that had shaped his life since childhood. Every move, every beat, every note had to be flawless. Crew members remembered him as kind, driven, but frail. His hands trembled, his body seemed thinner, and his eyes, once bright with electric energy, now carried exhaustion. He wanted to give his audience everything, but it was clear his body was no longer keeping up with his ambition. Behind the scenes, Dr. Conrad Murray, his personal physician, had become a constant presence. Hired for $150,000 a month by AEG Live, the concert promoters, Murray's job was to keep Michael healthy enough to perform. But in truth, Murray's role had become one of managing a fragile dependency, a nightly routine involving sedatives and a powerful anesthetic called propofol. It was not a drug meant for homes or bedrooms. It was a hospital-grade anesthesia, administered only under strict medical supervision. But for Michael, who suffered chronic insomnia, it had become his escape, a way to finally sleep. Murray, aware of the risks, continued to administer it, convincing himself he could control the situation. The night of June 24, 2009, Michael arrived home around midnight after a long rehearsal. He had performed brilliantly that night, dancing with the energy of a man determined to reclaim his crown. Crew members left the Staples Center amazed. He was happy, full of life, said Kenny Ortega, the show's director. But once home, that joy faded. The insomnia returned, gnawing at his nerves. He pleaded with Dr. Murray for his usual sleep aid. Murray tried various benzodiazepines, Valium, lorazepam, midazolam, but nothing worked. Michael was restless, anxious, and desperate. "Please," he said, according to Murray's later statement. "I need to sleep. I have to be ready for tomorrow." By around 1:30 a.m., Murray gave in. He prepared a small dose of propofol, diluted it with lidocaine to ease the burning sensation, and injected it slowly through in 4. Michael's breathing steadied. His body relaxed. The king of pop finally drifted into sleep. Murray claimed he stayed by his side, monitoring him, but phone records later showed that between 7 a.m. and 11 a.m., he made multiple calls to a girlfriend, his office, and other associates. During that time, Michael stopped breathing. His pulse faded to nothing. When Murray noticed, panic set in. He tried CPR, called for help, but it was too late. At 12:21 p.m., a frantic call went out to 911. "We have a gentleman here who needs help," said Alberto Alvarez, one of Michael's security team members. "He's not breathing." Paramedics rushed to the mansion and found him unresponsive, his skin cool, his body limp. His pupils were fixed and dilated. For more than 40 minutes, they tried to revive him. The scene was desperate: defibrillators, adrenaline, chest compressions, but nothing brought him back. At 2:26 p.m., at the UCLA Medical Center, Michael Joseph Jackson was pronounced dead. The world did not know yet. Outside, fans were going about their day, rehearsing, shopping, laughing, unaware that one of the most influential humans on Earth had just left it. News spread slowly, then all at once. TMZ was the first outlet to break the story, and within minutes, the internet crashed from the surge of searches. Networks cut into regular programming. Streets in Los Angeles filled with sobbing fans. Outside the hospital, crowds gathered, holding hands, crying, singing his songs. Around the globe, people stood in disbelief. Michael Jackson, gone. It felt impossible. Inside the hospital, chaos continued. Family members began to arrive: LaToya, Jermaine, Catherine, and others. They were hysterical, demanding answers. Catherine collapsed in tears. Jermaine was the one who addressed the press, reading the words that would echo for generations: "My brother, the legendary king of pop, Michael Jackson, passed away on Thursday, June 25, 2009, at 2:26 p.m. Those words marked the end of an era. As grief consumed fans, investigators began asking questions. What had killed him? The initial assumption was cardiac arrest, but suspicion quickly turned toward the role of medication. Detectives searched his bedroom and found a troubling scene: vials of sedatives, 4 tubing, oxygen tanks, and medical equipment scattered around. There was no emergency kit, no monitoring equipment that would normally accompany the use of propofol. It looked more like a desperate makeshift hospital room than a bedroom. Dr. Murray's behavior raised red flags immediately. He failed to tell paramedics about the propofol at first, and he waited nearly 25 minutes before calling 911. He made phone calls instead of seeking help. When investigators pressed him, he admitted to administering propofol but insisted it was a small dose. Toxicology results later told a different story. Michael had lethal levels of propofol in his system, along with traces of benzodiazepines. It was a fatal cocktail. The coroner's report confirmed what the world feared: Michael Jackson's death was a homicide. The cause: acute propofol intoxication, administered in a non-clinical setting without proper monitoring. The report detailed how his body was otherwise relatively healthy for a 50-year-old man, with no significant heart disease. It wasn't natural causes. It was negligence, or worse. As word spread, conspiracy theories ignited like wildfire. Some believed Murray was a scapegoat, that powerful forces in the entertainment industry wanted Michael gone. Others thought he had become too difficult, too expensive, and that his catalog, worth hundreds of millions, made his death convenient. Fans pointed fingers at AEG Live, accusing them of pushing him beyond human limits. His death felt too clean, too coincidental, too orchestrated. After all, he was on the verge of a massive comeback. Meanwhile, the house at Carrollwood became a shrine. Fans left flowers, notes, and candles. His children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, were sheltered from the chaos, but the image of young Paris tearfully saying at his memorial, "Daddy has been the best father you could ever imagine," broke hearts around the world. The memorial itself, held at the Staples Center, was broadcast to over 2.5 billion people, making it one of the most watched events in history. It wasn't just a funeral, it was a global farewell. But behind the mourning, there was rage. The Jackson family demanded justice. Dr. Conrad Murray was charged with involuntary manslaughter in 2010. During the trial, prosecutors painted him as reckless and greedy, more concerned with money than Michael's safety. The defense argued that Michael had begged for propofol and might have self-administered it while Murray wasn't looking. But the evidence was damning. Phone records, testimony, and the sheer negligence of leaving a patient unattended under anesthesia sealed his fate. In November 2011, Murray was found guilty and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Still, the verdict did little to quiet the debate. Many felt it was too light, that the true story went deeper. Some believed Michael was exploited until his very last breath, driven by those who saw him not as a man but as a commodity. Others saw his death as the tragic result of years of physical and emotional torment, a fragile genius finally undone by the very system that made him. That night, June 25, 2009, became more than a moment in time, it became a wound. For millions, the loss was personal. It was the day music died all over again. Streets around the world filled with dancing tributes. Radio stations played his songs non-stop. Candlelight vigils flickered in every major city. In a way, the world paused to remember not just the men who moonwalked across stages, but the boy who once sang about being a ABC. Yet beneath the grief, one question remained unresolved: was Michael's death truly an accident born of negligence, or was it something darker? Something planned? The official line said homicide through recklessness, but fans whispered otherwise. Some claimed to have seen inconsistencies in the timeline, others questioned why such powerful figures walked away untouched while only one man faced punishment. And as the years passed, those doubts never faded. They grew. They hardened. Because while the world had lost its brightest star, it had also gained a mystery, one that refused to rest. The night ended with the flashing lights of ambulances fading into the distance, leaving behind a city wrapped in disbelief. The world had lost its king, but his story was far from over. What followed wasn't peace, it was a courtroom battle, a storm of lawsuits, a legacy divided between adoration and suspicion. And when the trial began, when the testimonies unfolded, when the media circus returned for one final act, the truth about what really happened to Michael Jackson would become even more complicated than anyone imagined. The story of his death was not just the end of a life, it was the beginning of a fight for justice, legacy, and truth that continues to this day. The courtroom was silent except for the echo of camera shutters. Every lens, every eye, every headline was fixed on one man, Dr. Conrad Murray. Sitting in the defendant's chair, his expression was composed, but the weight of the world's fury pressed down on him. Across the world, millions watched as the trial of the man accused of killing Michael Jackson unfolded. For some, this was justice long overdue, for others, it was a distraction, an easy scapegoat for something much deeper. Michael's death had shattered more than hearts. It had torn open questions about greed, fame, manipulation, and the price of genius. And now, as the legal battle began, the search for truth became a global obsession. From the moment Michael was pronounced dead, the machinery of both justice and spectacle went into motion. The Los Angeles County coroner had ruled his death a homicide, caused by acute propofol intoxication in a non-clinical setting. That phrase alone carried devastating implications. It meant someone had killed him, whether through neglect or intent. And that someone, according to investigators, was Conrad Murray. The prosecution painted him as reckless, unqualified to handle such powerful drugs outside a hospital, and motivated by money, $150,000 a month to keep Michael alive and performing. In their narrative, Murray had crossed every boundary of medicine, becoming the man who gave the world's greatest performer his final dose. But as the trial began, another story emerged. The defense argued that Michael was desperate, sleepless, and addicted. They portrayed a man haunted by pressure, by the expectation to deliver 50 flawless shows in London, by decades of trauma and perfectionism. He begged for sleep, Murray's lawyers said. He administered it himself. To them, this wasn't murder, it was a tragedy born of exhaustion and dependency. The courtroom became a theater of grief and blame, and every witness added a new layer of complexity. Kenny Ortega, Michael's tour director, took the stand and described a man torn between brilliance and breakdown. He was thin. He was trembling. He was tired, Ortega said. But when the music started, he came alive. Others testified about his insomnia, his fear of failure, and his reliance on doctors to make him show-ready. It was heartbreaking, hearing the details, how a man worshipped by billions couldn't sleep without the very substance that would kill him. Then came the experts, anesthesiologists, pharmacologists, sleep specialists, all confirming one thing: propofol was never meant to be used at home. It required constant monitoring, oxygen support, and immediate intervention if breathing slowed. Murray had none of those tools. He was on the phone when Michael stopped breathing. He didn't call 911 immediately. He didn't have resuscitation equipment. To many, it was clear, Murray's negligence had cost a life. In November 2011, after weeks of testimony and nearly 2 years of media frenzy, the verdict came. We, the jury, find the defendant, Conrad Robert Murray, guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Gasps filled the courtroom. Outside, fans cheered, some cried, some chanted Michael's name. Inside, Murray sat motionless, his face a mask of disbelief. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, the maximum for involuntary manslaughter. But to many, 4 years wasn't enough. The men responsible for the death of a legend would serve less than 2. Even after the verdict, the questions didn't stop. If Murray was guilty, was he the only one? What about AEG Live, the promoters who had hired him, who pushed Michael to perform, who insured his shows for millions? The Jackson family thought the same. In 2013, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against AEG, claiming the company had negligently hired and supervised Murray. Katherine Jackson, his mother, sat through every day of that trial, her grief still raw years later. The evidence painted a haunting picture: emails from executives worrying about Michael's health but still pushing forward, financial pressure, and endless rehearsals. The family's attorney argued that AEG had cared more about profits than the men behind them. But AEG fought back. Their lawyers argued that Michael, not the company, had chosen Murray. That AEG couldn't have foreseen what the doctor would do. The jury sided with the company. No damages were awarded. For the family, it was another heartbreak, a reminder that in the world of fame, accountability often gets lost in the shadows. Years passed, but the shadow of that day in June 2009 never lifted. Documentaries, interviews, leaked reports, all tried to piece together the truth. Some claimed Michael was killed for his music catalog, a treasure trove of publishing rights that included his own songs and a massive portion of the Beatles. When Michael died, control of that catalog transferred to his estate, valued in the hundreds of millions. To conspiracy theorists, that was motive enough. They pointed fingers at the music industry, alleging hidden deals and silent beneficiaries. Others believed his death was the final chapter of a long campaign of exploitation. From his childhood in the Jackson 5 to his adult years, Michael had been used by everyone, from record labels to lawyers to those he thought were friends. Even in death, his image became a commodity. Tribute albums, posthumous releases, hologram performances, all profited from his legacy. The irony was painful: in trying to escape the machinery of fame, he had become its eternal fuel. But beyond the headlines and theories, there was another, more human story, the one carried by his children and family. Paris, just 11 when she lost her father, spoke years later about the trauma that followed. "He was my everything," she said. "When he died, I lost the only person who truly understood me." Prince and Blanket, too, struggled with the weight of being his children. Every move they made was dissected. Every appearance became a comparison. They inherited his fame, but also his ghosts. The public, meanwhile, couldn't let go. Candlelight vigils became annual rituals. Fans gathered outside Neverland, leaving flowers and messages. His music, Billie Jean, Thriller, Man in the Mirror, never left the airwaves. But even as millions celebrated his genius, others questioned his legacy. The resurfacing of old allegations, the 2019 documentary Leaving Neverland, reopened wounds. Once again, the world was divided, between those who saw him as an innocent victim of lies and those who believed he had hidden sins behind his brilliance. In death, Michael Jackson became more myth than man. His life, too vast and complex for one narrative, split into versions, each reflecting what people needed to believe. To some, he was the angelic artist destroyed by a cruel world. To others, he was a flawed human being, consumed by his own demons. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in the space between. But one thing remains certain: no artist, before or since, has moved the world quite like Michael. He redefined music videos, shattered racial barriers on television, and turned concerts into global spectacles. His voice, pure, emotional, otherworldly, still carries the weight of someone who gave everything for his art. His dancing, his compassion, his eccentricity, they all stitch together a portrait of a man too big for the world that tried to contain him. In the years since his passing, new generations have discovered him. On streaming platforms, his songs climb the charts again and again. Young dancers mimic his moves on TikTok. Artists from The Weeknd to Beyoncé to Bruno Mars cite him as the blueprint. Even as controversies swirl, his influence refuses to die. It's as though the music itself transcended the man, carrying forward his light while the world still debates his shadow. As time has passed, some of the fury has softened into reflection. People no longer just ask, was it murder or negligence? They ask what his life tells us about fame, power, and human fragility. About how someone so extraordinary could be so alone. About how a child star became a prisoner of his own legend. Michael once said in an interview, "The greatest education in the world is watching the masters at work." And in his own way, he became the ultimate masterclass, a lesson in brilliance, beauty, and the dangers of never being allowed to rest. Even now, more than a decade later, mysteries linger. The exact chain of events in his final hours, the missing minutes of Dr. Murray's phone logs, the unspoken truths behind corporate contracts, these remain pieces of a puzzle that may never be complete. And maybe that's fitting. Michael Jackson's life was never simple. It was a paradox: love and pain, art and exploitation, light and shadow. Every June 25th, fans around the world still gather. They sing his songs, light candles, and share stories of how he changed their lives. In those moments, it feels as if he never left. The air still hums with the rhythm he created, the beats that once made the world dance in unison. The man may have been mortal, but the myth, crafted through decades of music, scandal, and magic, refuses to die. Justice was served, but incompletely. Murray went to prison, the trials ended, but the questions remain. The industry moved on, but the hole Michael left never closed. His mansion stands empty, his voice preserved in recordings that feel alive. Somewhere between the sound and the silence lies the truth of a man who wanted only to create, to heal, to be loved. And so the story ends as it began, with a boy from Gary, Indiana, who looked at the world and believed he could change it through song. He did. But the cost of that gift was everything. His rise was legendary, his fall was tragic, and his death, mysterious. But his legacy, the music, the magic, the emotion, remains untouchable. Perhaps that is the final answer to the question that still divides the world. Was Michael Jackson's death murder or medical negligence? Maybe it was both, or neither. Maybe it was the inevitable conclusion of a life that burned too bright for too long. The truth may never be fully known. But his music still echoes, his influence still breathes, and his legend, complex, beautiful, and eternal, still stands. Because even in death, Michael Jackson remains what he always was, the sound of a world dreaming.